was glad when they said, come let us go to the house of the Lord. I was glad when they say, come let us go to the church with no walls. You are my brother, you are my sister. From all over the world we are united in the house of God, in the church with no walls.
Welcome to this edition of the Church with No Walls podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Dearbone, and I am glad to be joined today by Miss Charlene Quint. Charlene is a family law attorney in Chicago. She's also the founder of Abuse Care, a non-denominational faith-based organization that's designed to provide hope and healing to women on their journey from victim to victorious, as well as educate and equip faith communities and businesses in caring for victims of domestic violence. She also serves as the board of trustees for the Northern Seminary in, I believe it's Lisle, Illinois. I believe I'm saying
Correct.
that correct. And she's also the winner of the 2021 Christian Literary Award and the 2022 Christian Indie Publisher Award. So, Charlene, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. This is fantastic. Appreciate it.
And Charlene, we've talked before offline a little bit about the necessity of these outreach ministries, and your outreach ministry. It struck me, this is amazing work that you're doing, because a lot of people think about domestic violence and they think about it in certain ways, but they don't always think about it from, a biblical stance, from a religious stance, and how that plays into just life in general. So, first off, what is the prevalence of domestic abuse? Is it something that a large amount of people are affected by, or is it a smaller number based off of, your work and your research?
Well, the research shows an alarming number, actually, of the prevalence of domestic violence. The research shows that 35% of women will experience rape or stalking or severe physical abuse sometime in their life, and that 48% of women will experience coercive control or verbal and emotional abuse. So for women, that's half the population that's experiencing some kind of domestic violence. I just read in the Chicago Tribune yesterday, the state's attorney said that the number one problem in Chicago isn't crime, it's domestic violence, which is, sad. 23, there was 23 murders last year due to domestic violence. So it's a real problem, and it's across all demographics.
Yeah, I mean that's staggering to me, to think that if I'm looking around, almost one in three or one in every four women I see are in some way a victim of domestic violence. I mean, I have two little girls, and that scares me to think that they could possibly be in that number at some point in their life.
Yeah. One in three, or one in two, actually,
Hmm.
for a coercive control or verbal and emotional abuse. So it's really prevalent, and the church needs to be leading the way on how to address it and how to change it. But
And
unfortunately, we're not. But that's why we're on your podcast.
absolutely. And you mentioned that it's not just about physical abuse, hitting a woman, or hitting somebody. It's about other ways of control. Talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, one of the biggest, I guess, myths or misunderstanding about domestic violence is that many people think it's just hitting or using a weapon, and domestic violence is so much larger than that. Really, abuse is about gaining and maintaining power and control over somebody else. And in the family setting, that's your intimate partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, wife, husband, and usually kids are involved as well. So there's a lot of ways to maintain power and control. The most common form of domestic abuse is verbal and emotional abuse. And that's prevalent in 100% of abusive situations, according to the studies, because it's just so easy to inflict, and it's so easy to deny and claim that nothing happened. So that's the most prevalent. The next most prevalent is financial abuse, which is prevalent in 99% of situations, of abusive situations. And that looks like well, we all know that money is power, right? So abusers know that money is power, and so they make it very difficult for their victim or their target to have access to money. So one of the ways that they'll do that is by convincing convincing the target that that person doesn't need to work anymore because he makes enough money, he or she makes enough money. And I'm going to use he and she as pronouns because the statistics show that 90% of abusers are men. So apologies to all the good men in your audience, but the statistics show that that's unfortunately the case. So we usually have the situation where an abuser is a husband or or boyfriend, and the victim is usually the girlfriend or the wife. So, but financial abuse is very prevalent, and it's often the accounts are in the husband's name. He's the major breadwinner. Her name is not on the account. She has to beg for money to use it. That the house and the assets are all in his name. So that's one of the obviously very prevalent ways to abuse. Physical abuse is which is what we commonly think of, but really smart abusers, they don't leave bruises. So some physical abuse includes, leaving someone, driving in the car and just sending him out of the car and driving away and leaving that person in a very difficult spot, or in harm's way. Or throwing things and punching walls to intimidate somebody. Of course, punching and things like that are physical abuse, but there's other ways that the bruises aren't left. Sometimes even not getting someone to a doctor's office when they need it, when they're particularly vulnerable. I mean, I've known women and have counseled women who have had to have their babies at home because their husband refused to take them to the hospital to have birth. So whenever someone's in a vulnerable position, an abuser will take advantage. Something we don't often think about is spiritual abuse. And this is, oftentimes where the church needs to come in as well. But when someone takes the scripture and twists it to justify their abuse and try to get that person to stay in an abusive situation, that's or to say, well, you're not being a good enough Christian or good enough whatever your faith is. So using the holy texts of whatever that person's faith is against them. And then of course there's sexual abuse, which is prevalent in almost every situation, particularly long-term situations and long-term relationships where sex is coerced, or it's just flat out rape. So, and that happens actually, sexual assault, which is rape, happens in 80% of abusive relationships, and over I think it's 68% of the time it happens again and again and again. So it's a real situation that we need to address and understand.
Wow. And so you were mentioning that there's financial, sexual abuse, all these different types of abuse, and that unfortunately men are 90% of the ones to do it. When it comes to people that are in the church, do we see less of this, or are the numbers about the same? How does that shake out?
Well, I would like to say that we don't see that in church much, but unfortunately, the studies show that there is no difference in the number of domestic abuse situations in the church or outside of the church. But unfortunately, within the church, it often gets hidden. And the victims often receive bad advice, incorrect advice. It's actually dangerous. And, sadly enough, the churches often side with an abuser versus a victim and continue to try to keep that relationship going, particularly if it's a marriage. And we need to have a better understanding of what God sees as acceptable and not acceptable in these relationships.
And so why is it you said the church tends to side with the abuser? Why is that? Is there like a reason, a pattern why the church, when, generally we're taught that any type of abuse is wrong, why they would side with somebody who they either know or believe to be an abuser?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. I think one of the reasons, particularly if it's regarding a married couple, they churches tend, not all churches, but some churches tend to just value the marriage above everything else. No matter what, the marriage has to survive, has to go on. And so they'll tell the victim, oh, you just have to pray some more. Oh, you need to be more submissive. You need to give your husband more sex. You need to do all these things, not realizing that none of that makes a difference. A true abuser will abuse because that's their nature versus anything what someone else does. So you can see how that would actually be dangerous to the victim in these cases, and also just have a very difficult time on her faith, because yes, we're taught to love others, and when you're in an abusive situation, you would think that the church would hold abusers accountable, but all too often they kind of do some victim blaming and say, well, you should be doing this, as if she's causing it, but that's not the case. Also, there is certainly a great deal of what's called cognitive dissonance going on. Cognitive dissonance is a kind of psychological term where we can't have two completely opposite notions in our mind at the same time. So we try to resolve that. And in this case, what we want to think is that the person sitting next to us in the church pew, or that is an elder or a deacon in the church, or sometimes even a pastor, because I've had to counsel pastors' wives, but the person sitting next to us, we want to think is a good guy, right? Or a good person, because they're in our church, and that reflects on us. We don't want to be in a church with people that are horrible people, right? We don't want to be the friend of Jeffrey Epstein when all this comes out,
Right.
right? So
Right.
so we want to think that that he's a good person. And then we hear these stories of the facts that, like, wow, he's really a monster behind closed doors, because he looks so great in person, right? They put on a show. And so when we hear these facts of that, someone says, well, this is what they do behind closed doors, and that's why I'm leaving, and that's why I'm in a shelter. We don't want to believe that, right? Because then what do we have to do? Well, we'll have to take some action. I guess we not really don't want to be friends with a person that punches his spouse. And we don't want to be, on the country club with the person that is doing this. So we're going to have to change. What is the church going to do? Are we going to impose discipline? Are we going to push him out? Are we going to have to go? There's all sorts of things if that is in fact the case. So it's easier to say, well, she's just exaggerating, or she's making it up, or she's lying. And then you don't have to do anything, because to save herself, she's going to actually leave the church, right? And that solves the problem. She's left, and now he's here. And you can still keep on doing what you've done. He could still be the deacon or the elder, or, the usher, whatever. And we don't have to do anything. So we've resolved that cognitive dissonance by saying, oh, it's got to be her. It's got to be something that she's not doing right. And so they do that, or sometimes churches will say, well, we're just not going to take a side. You bring this to the elders or the pastor and say, we're not going to take a side. But not taking a side is like not taking a side between, a fight between a tiger and a bunny, right? This is who's going to win if you don't take the side on that one. So yeah, there's a lot of churches that just don't understand domestic abuse, that give bad counsel, and then they don't hold people accountable. We have, the Bible talks about sheep and wolves. We need to protect the sheep and keep the wolves away. We shouldn't be the haven for the wolves, but oftentimes that is the case. And then the sheep, the people who are being abused, have to find a safe church, because that church is no longer safe, because that's where their abuser is. So it's a bit of a complicated matter, but I mean, that's the bottom line. And I think because of the patriarchal nature of a lot of churches, they tend to view the men in the relationship as the more incredible one. And a lot of churches have only male leadership, and so they don't get the dynamics of this domestic abuse.
And it would seem to me that in a way, when the church either doesn't take a side or sides with the abuser, that just emboldens the abuser because they feel like, okay, the church hasn't come down on me, so that means what I'm doing must be okay. They've told themselves that what they're doing is okay already, and by not having somebody from their church say, "Hey, man, you got to stop this," or "This is not right. You're hurting your wife, you're hurting your family," it gives them license to continue to do it, or maybe even to elevate the level of it because now the victim has expressed to somebody else in the church what's going on, and now that's almost a well, the rise and the elevation of the abuse raises. Am I correct on that?
100%. And that's exactly what happens when churches either don't do anything or side with an abuser. Um, I've seen it play out in a number of churches. And when when the church takes the side of the abuser or doesn't do anything exactly right, it emboldens the abuser, right? Because now they've played the pastor, they've played the leadership, they've played other people in church, and they will use that to divide the church, certainly, because it's a me versus her type of thing. So they will use that to divide the church and slander and cause division in the church. But you're right, it emboldens them. So the abuse escalates and increases because he knows that the church is now on his side, and so he will use that against her. But I've also seen when churches take a side and say we're going to hold this person accountable, and we're not going to side with him. We are going to support the victim. I have seen that take place, and it gives the victims that they feel safer in that church. Sometimes there's an order of protection, and the churches will say, okay, well, you go to if you're going to come here, go to a different service so that she can worship in peace and her children are protected. And it also gives a message to the kids and the rest of the congregation that no, we're a church that protects the sheep, and we believe that we should treat one another in love. And so eventually, because the abuser has not been supported, he often will leave the church and find someplace else to worship, or just not do it altogether because he was really not very sincere. But I've also seen abusers that have been supported by the church, use the church as a way to get the next victim, right? Because they're in church and the ex is no longer attending, and so they can tell the next victim, "Oh, I'm a good church boy, and here's my church," and they, and the church is a great feeding ground for these predators. I mean, that's truly what they are. They're predators. So yeah, the dynamics are very predictable.
So the thought may be that if somebody abuses their partner or their spouse, that they would also abuse their children. Is that the case? Is it a cyclical thing where they abuse everybody, or they only train their abuse on one particular person?
Well, studies have shown that when someone abuses an intimate partner, they also very likely, in 70% or more of the cases, abuse children as well. Um, so the primary target might be their partner, but the children often get it as well. And it's awful just as destructive to the children to see, for example, their mom being abused, just watching that and and that's traumatizing to them. And then that's what they learn, right? Because unfortunately, domestic abuse is a generational sin. We talk about generational sins. This is one of them because children learn from their parents. Well, like, this is how it is, I guess, right? Um, when they see this complete dysfunction and abuse going on. And so the studies have shown that boys raised in abusive situations are 10 times more likely to become abusive themselves, and girls are 6 times more likely to choose an abuser as a partner. So we need to be mindful that these people are showing the next generation how to relate, so it just perpetuates itself. And it really only stops until one person stands up and says, it stops with me and my kids. This stops. And that's really one of the hardest things a person can do, is to get herself out of that situation and get a safe place for herself and her children.
And so now you said that the abuser tends to abuse the children. Why? Is it a power thing? Is it because they why would they abuse the child as well as the partner or spouse? Is there a connection between?
Mhm. Well, it's power and control, right? So abusers are predators, and they tend to choose targets that have less power and than they have. And children, of course, are powerless.
Yeah.
Typically women have less power than men. But I call them equal opportunity abusers, because you will see they are um and in the workplace, they cause problems in the workplace oftentimes, because they are abusing people that have less rank than they are in the workplace, or have less power. So just overall, and they often abuse animals. If there's pets, they're often abusive to pets or the elderly. So it's a mindset of, I'm I'm in power, I'm in control, and I get to do what I want. So really it comes down to an issue of pride, right? That the sin of pride. I I can do what I want. I don't have to follow the rules. I don't have to follow God's rules. I'm just going to do what I want. And then that seeps out into everything that they do. So from a spiritual perspective, that's the sin that causes all of this. And we see that in the Bible time and time again, when the Bible says, God's against the prideful. And because this is what happens, right? And then when we read the Old Testament, what happens to the kings of Israel when they finally get to power? They get filled with pride, and then they ignore God and do all sorts of abuses on their people. So
Wow. So, what type of person is an abuser? What are some of the signs? I mean, are they signs that are overt that you see, or some ones that you miss? But what is the makeup of an abuser?
yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes they are undiagnosed cluster B personality disorders. So the psychological um, there's a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and this is the book of the disorders that people have, and cluster B disorders have a general inability to self-regulate and self-control themselves. So we look at things like narcissistic personality disorder, and we look at things like antisocial personality disorder, from where we get sociopaths and psychopaths, right? And um, we have a borderline personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder under that category. But the two major ones where we see abusers coming from, is this narcissistic personality disorder, and so narcissists, in other words, and sociopaths or psychopaths, where they have a lack of empathy for other people. And even if you're not on, let me preface that just saying, even if you haven't been, someone hasn't been diagnosed with that, the, like everything else, it's on a scale, right? You maybe even not be diagnosed, but if you're higher on that scale, these are the things that you're going to be exhibiting. And that includes, lack of conscience. They just don't have any remorse. The narcissists want to be worshipped, and they want people to, cater to them. So they're very they're very arrogant and haughty. The sociopaths just have a complete disregard for other people's feelings and rights, and really no remorse after they've barged through. So when the true selves come out, that's what we see, but that's behind closed doors, right? Oftentimes to the public, to somebody they want to impress, oh, they're very charming, right? They know what to say. They know how to act. They know how to look good in front of people. And they do it in church all the time, right? They're the friendly ones that greet you at the door. And so they're really one way in front of others and behind closed doors. So this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality, which is another reason why we talked about why does the church not recognize it? Well, because they're so charming and charismatic when they're around church people that they want to impress, or around their boss, or around someone with money that they want to impress. They're one way. But then we close the door and there's some very different to their family. So, and that is one reason why I hear time and time again from women, it's like, my church doesn't believe me. They just won't, they just can't believe that he is like this. And like, well, that's a very common thing. And, studies show that women actually feel more harmed by the lack of church support than the betrayal of their spouse.
Wow.
Because, well, they have finally figured out what their spouse is like, but then when they go to the church, thinking this is the core of my being, and I've been in the church for my whole life, and I've volunteered there and raised my kids there, and then you tell the pastor or the leaders that what's happening, and they turn their back, which is often the case. That women are often just shaken to the core. And sometimes they even leave the church. They go, this is just a bunch of hypocrites. I don't want anything to do with it anymore. So we really need to the church needs to get their act together.
I would imagine that would put the woman even at more risk because she's being more isolated. She's no longer with her church family, and who knows about her other friends or people around her. So she's becoming more isolated and in maybe some ways more dependent on the abuser.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's often the case, that she's just more isolated, which is, by design of the abuser. He's going to, one of the things you can just count on is once a division happens, when women are again, normally women, but when a victim leaves an abuser, you can guarantee a few things will happen. And one of those things is he will go to his church and slander her and say, why, oh, my wife abandoned me and I didn't do anything wrong and it's all her fault. And so they, people only get one side, and then they assume that he's telling the truth. And so she's more and more isolated. But that's absolutely right. And he'll do the same thing to the children too. Your mom is leaving us. She's abandoned us. She's got mental health issues. That's always a common one. Or she's having an affair because, that always puts the blame on her. So that's the trifecta. She's got mental illness, she's abandoning us, and she's, had an affair because it couldn't be that she's left because of his, bad behavior. So has to blame something else.
And so it's kind of off of that question, why would a woman or why would a victim marry their abuser? It's one thing to be in a relationship with them, but to take it to that next level of marriage, why would they do that?
Great question. Yeah, because we often look at this like, well, you knew and I've heard this before from people, you knew what you were getting into, but that is actually not the case. Because there's three distinct phases of a romantic relationship with any type of abuser. So the first phase, they call the love bombing phase, right? So he has targeted somebody. So he's targeted, and just universally, the women that I have counseled or represented as an attorney, they're they're just lovely women. They're kind, they're giving, they're forgiving, they put God first. They really want to um, invest in relationships. So they're oftentimes are people pleasers. And so he's targeted this person with all these great characteristics. And he has put on an Oscar-worthy performance that he is Mr. Nice Guy, that he is Prince Charming, that he is this wonderful Christian man, and he may even quote Bible verses and do all the Christian lingo and stuff like that. But that is all a game to get his target emotionally and financially attached to him. I mean, he's basically trying to get his claws into his victim to make sure that she's now financially and emotionally attached. And so so yes, during that phase, the target is thinking, oh, this is wonderful. I'm being wined and dined. And they move pretty quickly. Also, that's another thing. They want to quickly wrap this deal up. So they move quickly. And, she's just kind of overwhelmed with all this niceness, thinking, oh, God has just plunked this wonderful man in my life. And then the next phase, you say I do, or you have a baby together, or you buy a house together, or something that literally seals that deal, right? Because then you are financially enmeshed with another person and emotionally enmeshed with another person. And that's when the wheels come off the bus. So we call that the devaluation stage. And it often happens very quickly, right after the wedding ceremony, right after the baby comes, right after the house is purchased or you go into business together, because now he knows that she's in, right? It's going to be difficult to get out. So the real personality comes out, and that's when the abuse starts happening. And then the last phase, we can that middle phase of the devaluation phase can last for months or oftentimes years or decades as she is trying to figure what happened here. And so you see many of my clients have been married for 20, 30 years or more. So they try to stick it in there because she does invest in relationships and no one wants to leave a family. And then the discards phase, when the relationship is over, he's on to the next one. And you know I he discards her like an old kitchen appliance that doesn't work. Let's get a new toaster because the old one doesn't work, and he's off to the next one doing the same thing. So he repeats the cycle with the next target.
So he has the ability to leave because he's the powerful one, whereas she is left scared and unable to leave because she's so invested and meshed in, whether through, like I said, marriage or ownership of a house or something like that. So he has if he chooses to leave, he can, but
Yeah.
she can't.
Yeah. And he's never been emotionally invested. I think that's the
Mhm.
thing to say. He can move on because these people have a difficult time forming real attachments, right? They're just it's all about themselves, and they use people. That's a common characteristic is they're just, what can this person do for me? As opposed to, what a gift that God put in my life of having this wonderful spouse and these wonderful children, and people. And that's how God wants us to look at people, with like, this is a gift that God's given us, but they look at people as objects to use. And so when you're no longer useful, just like when your toaster is no longer useful, you just move on to the next one. So that's the mindset. They really like their money, so they cherish their money and they use people as opposed to cherishing people and using money. So it's a very different mindset. Um,
And so a lot of times I've seen people talk about it on television and other things. Oh, well, we're going to go to therapy. We're going to go to counseling. We're going to do all these things to try to strengthen the marriage, to maybe stop him from maybe if he goes to therapy, he won't abuse me anymore. If he feels better about himself because we went to a marriage counselor, these things won't keep happening.
Mhm.
Does that work? Is that a solution, or is that just kind of a a fantasy that the victim is telling themselves in order to carry on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oftentimes we think if we go to counseling and sprinkle a little Jesus dust on the abuser, that they'll be better. But um, all the domestic violence groups say that marriage counseling is contraindicated, which means we shouldn't go to marriage counseling or couples counseling with someone who's abusive, because what they do is they will turn the charm on to the counselor. And they just get educated about the words to use. And they typically use that counseling to get more educated and then claim that the victim is the abuser. So I see these turn all the time. And when the real abuser says, "Oh, you're abusive, you're this, you're that," and you know, she's like, "Wow, what happened to counseling? It's not working here." And the fact is that counseling doesn't work for anybody that doesn't want to change. That's the I mean, that's the bottom line with people that are narcissists and sociopaths. You know, they've done extensive research on it. There's no counseling that's going to work on them because they don't want to change. There's no drugs that they can take that can make it different. You know, when it's other times of mental illness, if you have depression or anxiety, there's a counseling and some medicine can really alleviate that. But in this case, you know, they're intentionally trying to harm somebody else. So counseling doesn't work. And you know that, but you're right. That's one of the reasons why women stay in these abusive marriages. I mean, the number one reason being lack of finances, because she's, you know, has often been told not to work or has been prohibited from working, or he takes the paycheck. And you know, if she does work and or she's in a lower earning job than he is, so lack of finances is you know the number one reason. But other reasons are she thinks this counseling is going to work. If I just do this, it's going to be different, which is not the case. She may hang in there for Prince Charming to come back, but unfortunately, once you go from one phase to the next phase, it they don't go back. So that's another reason why they stay in. Of course, another reason maybe, well, you know, if they're a religious person, they may say, I really don't want God to be mad at me, and he's going to be mad at me if I divorce. So they have been getting bad information from either their church or somebody else, or their own reading of the Bible, or the abuser tells them, like, you know, you're going to make God mad. So there's a number of reasons. I think the most common reason that people do stay in these marriages with children is because they want to protect the kids. They don't want to blow up their family, right? And they want to say, okay, we know that two parents are better than one, and you know it's going to be difficult, and maybe dad is threatening to do something, harm them, or just cut her off financially if there's a divorce involved. So they stay to protect the kids until they can't anymore. And really, the when women realize they're unable to protect their children anymore is often the times when they say, okay, I just have to get out, and I have to figure out a way to get out with my kids to save my sanity, to save the kids, to save my own mental and physical health.
And you touched on the threat of harm to them, harm to their children.
Mhm.
How how many times is that just an empty threat by the abuser to keep the victim and the children around? And how many times does it actually turn out that if somebody leaves, takes the children, goes to a safe place or a safe space,
Mm.
that the abuser will actually try to physically harm them, find them, kill them, any of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, this is how that usually works out. Sometimes abusers will threaten to harm themselves. If you leave, I'm going to kill myself. All right, those are usually manipulations, you know, so they're just doing that to see if that works, right? But if they're actually threatening to harm the other person, I would take those threats seriously, because all too often we see that actually come through. And if it's not a physical harm, it's it's coming after them in the courtroom and trying to get sole custody of the children. And so they're, in a court battle for years and years and years. And until the kids turn 18, they'll come back and try to, get full custody of the kids. Unfortunately, some of my cases, what is it now, 2025, I had cases since 2017 that continually have been in the court for almost continually for the last 7 years, and will be until the kids get to be 18, because the abusers just keep coming back and wanting to, wanting sole custody or no, no child support, something like that. The statistics show that certainly there's the murder rates. Most victims know their abusers, or know their perpetrators, and oftentimes that is their abuser. The vast majority of murder suicides are because of these domestic violence situations. Almost every time you hear of at least a woman being killed, it's because of a domestic violence situation. So the most dangerous time for her is when she actually leaves, because he is now realizing that he has lost control, and they go, they just lose their mind. And that's one reason why women stay, because it's actually safer to stay than it is to leave. It is multiple times more dangerous to leave than to stay, because they, that's just a really dangerous time. And when most of the murders occur, and it really doesn't matter what socioeconomic status you're in. I live in an area, just a couple years ago, there was a couple that was, in a $1 million house, and he came in and, killed his wife, killed his 3 kids, even killed his mother, who was staying with the kids. It's just, and yeah, it was, and then himself. So it's these people, they lose their mind, because they've lost power and control. So.
We'll continue this conversation with Charlene Quint on our next episode. You've been listening to the Church with No Walls podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Dearbone. Take care and be blessed.